Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to the Sports Spectrum Podcast. My name is Jason Romano. Thank you so much for joining us here, wherever you're listening on the podcast today. As always, you can subscribe and download this podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, everywhere podcasts are found. And, of course, all of our content can be found at sportsspectrum.com, where you can become a member and partner with us for just $36. That covers the entire year. And you become a Sports Spectrum family member, where you get our quarterly magazine and our latest edition with New York Yankees slugger Aaron Judge on the cover just came out. And you also kind of help fund and partner with the productions that we're doing here at Sports Spectrum, including the podcast, including Football Sunday, which came out during the Super Bowl, and lots of other great content as well that you can find over at sportsspectrum.com. So just $36, go check it out. $36 gets you a subscription, gets you a partnership, gets you to become a member of the Sports Spectrum family. Today's guest, she is Tina Cervasio, and Tina currently is the Fox 5 New York lead sports anchor and reporter, as well as the host of the Sunday night sports show Sports Extra. She's the first woman to serve as permanent host of Sports Extra, which has been on the air for nearly half a century. She's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning sports journalist, a 1996 graduate of the University of Maryland. In 2015, she became the first female lead host on SiriusXM's NBA radio, and she's a longtime reporter with MSG, Madison Square Garden's network, on the New York Knicks broadcasts from 2008 to 2015. On this podcast, Tina and I talk a lot about broadcasting and kind of her journey into the broadcasting field, kind of working her way up in the business and the grind that it is to make your headway in this business. So we talk a lot about that. We also talk about her faith, and Tina shares kind of her journey on where she first heard about the Lord during her teen years, and then kind of coming back to God after some adversity came her way with her and her husband, both personally with some health issues and then within her job. We also talk about identity and how difficult that is for so many of us to not be identified by what we do. And for Tina, she struggled with that for many years as well. And recently, just recently, came to the realization that she is not identified by her job as a broadcaster. She is identified as a child of God. So this interview is really good. I think you guys will love hearing Tina's story. Without further ado, let's get right to it. Here she is, Fox 5 New York's lead sports anchor and reporter and the host of Sports Extra. She is Tina Cervasio. Tina, welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast. How are you?
I'm great, Jason. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's awesome to talk to you. We've been sort of Twitter friends for a long time here, and yes. It's been exciting. You've been a person I've wanted to have on the podcast for a while, and I'm glad we were finally able to make it happen. Now, I know that you were recently named as the lead sports anchor reporter with Fox 5 in New York. I just want to know how the new gig is going for you. How's it been?
Oh, it's good. It's amazing. It's so different than any other sports job I've ever had. Because it's actually a news job. And I'm doing sports because that's my specialty. I kind of use the example in our news meeting every morning. There is the political reporter that speaks first, the business reporter, and then they turn it over to sports, because that's how much, and that's our approach. It's how sports is influencing and impacting not just the greater New York City area, but our country, our world, how we can help our viewers maybe learn something that, the old fashioned way was a 3-minute sports anchor gets to do their highlights and scores. I don't do highlights and scores Monday through Thursday. I do sports stories. So it's been really interesting, and I love it.
Do you like going out into, because you've had a long history of different jobs, and we'll talk about a lot of those sort of jobs in a little bit, being, a reporter. Certainly many people know you for being the longtime reporter with the Knicks on their broadcast for many years. So describe the differences between a job like that and what you're doing now as sort of an anchor / reporter / news person.
Right. So for so many years, I was really a sideline reporter and in certain roles, a host for the pregame and halftime, or pregame, halftime, postgame, so to speak. And so it was more being at the game and being about that game. What is this game about? Who are the players involved? Who are the matchups? More of the X's and O's. And then while you're in a game, whether it was with the Knicks or the last 2 years I was at CBS Sports Network doing college football, college basketball, what insight and can I give from the field, from the court that our viewers can't see or our play-by-play and analysts couldn't see? So it was more in the moment of the game, that type of information, where, one of my stories I did this past week was on the WWE and how it has become mainstream and it's respected by athletes and celebrities, but it's also headlining sportscasts and sports shows, and it's on sports pages. So, I'm doing a lot of sports business stories, so to speak. And Monday I have a big story coming up, and it's not breaking news. It's something that I'm going to be working on over the next couple of weeks, about mental health in sports and athletes, and how we're hearing so much come forth about top athletes struggling with different diagnoses, whether it's depression or anxiety, how people have dealt with it. Some might deal with it spiritually and through their faith, and some deal with it with medication. So I'm going to be delving into that over the next few weeks.
Yeah, the Kevin Love story from the Players Tribune really brought that to the forefront. So look forward to checking that out. Well, let's go back and kind of go, in the time machine a little bit and go back to your childhood growing up in New Jersey and what life was like for you, Tina, back when you were a youngster, and just what that world was like for you being a kid growing up. Were you a sports fan? What was life like back then?
Yeah. And I always, it's interesting because I always feel guilty almost when I say this, Jason, but I was so, and I'm emotional thinking about this. I was so blessed as a little girl. Great family. I had 3 of my grandparents alive up until my adulthood. My parents, we were good Italian-American Catholics, every Sunday going to church like 9 a.m., go home, have our macaroni dinner on Sunday afternoons. As I grew up, though, I was so my parents had 2 girls. So it was me and my younger sister. My dad, wasn't some big, superstar quarterback for the Giants, but he did play college football at Cornell and just loved sports. And my mom was a teacher, and her brother, her cousins, so a lot of my uncles, my extended cousins, which I would call uncles, and even on my father's side, everybody was involved in sports in some capacity, and how it related to education and the discipline that you get from being involved in sports. So that's how sports sort of influenced my life. Had a great family life. My dad would take me. We would watch college games on Saturdays. We would watch the Giants on Sundays with my late grandfather, big Giants fan. My dad would take me to games. We would go back to Cornell. We would go see my uncle who coached freshman football on a Friday night. And then Saturday we would go to the varsity games. And then eventually I tried pretty much every sport. I wasn't good if there was a ball involved. But I found my way through, because I always did dance. My mother always had me in dance, and I loved it. And then my first favorite athlete was Nadia Comaneci. So gymnastics. Yeah. So I did gymnastics, and then I evolved into cheerleading was my big thing. I was good at it with the stunts and the cheering and all of that, but also track and field. I found a love in running, and that came from my dad. He ran marathons and did long distance running in his adult years after graduating from college, and would go on runs with my dad on vacations. So found my way in track and field, and that's something I've carried to my adult life. I've ran a few marathons, and so I was really blessed. And then I was about 10 years old was when my dad's really good friends, they had, quote, converted, and they had started becoming ministers, and they were in this, what my dad would call the Bible church. So then we went one Thursday night to a night service, and there was singing, and it was different. And my sister and I would call it the singing church, but we really liked it. And then we became, again, there's so many terms these days, but then we became saved and born again Christians, and started going to a full gospel church about that. But and that I was heading into my teenage years, so it was almost like I struggled a little bit because I felt like it was a very strict church. So, and I was in dance, and I was in like strict, like very beautiful ballet, and then there would be tap dancing and jazz, and to them at that time it was sinful. So I would struggle with that, but my mother kept me in dance. And I would struggle with listening to, pop songs that were pretty harmless, but of course we couldn't listen to mainstream music. So there was a struggle through my teens. So I never made it a really big deal, running around telling my friends, Jesus could save you and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then in college, and again, I had a wonderful, very protected, blessed life. I mean, I lost my grandparents when they were older. They were, one was to cancer, the other two were sudden, but in the end, they were in their late 70s or early 80s. I kind of fell away in college.
Yeah.
And, but then, as we go along here, I found my way back in many different ways. Thank God.
Absolutely. Now, when did broadcasting become something that you were like, this is something I want to do? Was it when you got to college? You went to the University of Maryland. Was it when you got to Maryland?
Actually, it was right around that time when I was 10, 12 years old. So my father took us, like I said, I would go to high school games with him on Saturdays. He took our family to the Rose Bowl in 1986, Iowa versus UCLA. So we spent a week in Pasadena and in Hollywood. It was our family vacation after Christmas, and we went throughout the new year. We went to the Rose Parade. And I had already loved college football, but this was so neat because we were at the same hotel as the Iowa families. So they were wearing their sons' jerseys, and I was learning players' names and their jersey numbers and what position they played and what part of the country they were from. And I was really getting into it. Who would they be facing in the defense versus the offense? And I just got so into it that week. And we rooted for Iowa and they lost. But it was that moment during the game, and I just remember it being packed, and we were like on the 10-yard line, and the bands are playing, and we're following the game, and my dad's talking about this running back, and I think it was Eric Ball and et cetera, and he said, as you get into middle school and high school now, you should start thinking of a career that leads you to sports because you love it, and then you could do something that you love and just find somebody to pay you for it.
Right, exactly.
And at the time, I really loved watching, and Barbara Walters was doing the news, and I really wanted to be a newscaster. But then I realized as I was going through high school as I was going through high school, I was focusing more on being a news broadcaster. And then I loved writing and public speaking, had no fear getting up in front of people to speak. And then when I got to college and being a sports fan, that's when I learned and started seeing more of Gail Gardner on television and Hannah Storm hosting the NBA on NBC, the good old days. And,
oh, yeah.
And then Linda Cohn. We had ESPN in our dorm common area, and I was on the same floor with a lot of women soccer players, and we would go in and watch Sports Center, and there was Linda Cohn, and she had a New York accent, and I was like, oh, I have to do this. News is cool, but I would so much rather be covering college football, an NFL game, than presidential elections or a shooting or something like that. So that's when I said, oh, I could direct what I could do. Now women are doing sports, so I want to do that too.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I wonder for you, because I was going to say women in sports back then, I would say there weren't as many women that you could turn on TV and see as there are today, in my opinion. So I wonder what type of influence that had, because for you, as you're going into something like this, was there ever any pushback, even in college? Like maybe you want to try something else, maybe you want to try something different, or did you have the right support system in place?
I had the right support system in place, and I didn't realize how hard it would be and how hard it would still be 20 years later.
Yeah.
But my parents were all for it. My father thought it was fantastic because it was journalism and sports. And there were other women too. And this is unbelievable. My friend actually passed away, Kelly Pine. She died of cervical cancer a couple of years ago. And she was the other woman. She was a field hockey player at Maryland. And her and I were the women in the journalism classes that wanted to be sports broadcasters.
Yeah.
So
and there was two of you. That gives you an idea.
That's a very good point. But I was really close with the guys. So thinking about Joel D. Smith and Brian Colleran, who are actually both they're successful in the news broadcast industry. They're both newscasters right now. My friend Joel is coming back into sports. But we had a good little circle, and we would support each other. And there were guys before me that I'm still in touch with that are in the industry as well, that on our radio station we would work together. And so I had a good support system. So I never thought it would be a struggle for a woman, or I'd be outcasted, because I was watching Leslie Visser on Monday nights on Monday Night Football, and I was watching Linda all the time on Sports Center, and she was so young at the time. And I think, I'm trying to think of any. Oh, and then so here was the big aha moment. Yes, you could do this, Tina. In my junior year, Bonnie Bernstein came back to her alma mater, and she was doing the Thursday night college football game between Maryland and Georgia Tech on campus for ESPN as a sideline reporter, and she skyrocketed. She's brilliant. I'm still friends with her today. And there were also less women in the industry at the time. So she got a chance a couple of years out of college and became, the headlining sideline reporter on ESPN college football. So she came back and shared her experience. And I realized how much hard work and study and learning the game it would take. But it gave me even more faith or motivated me even more. Hey, Bonnie just graduated from here. Look, she's on ESPN tonight. I could do this.
Right, exactly. It's someone to look up to. That's really cool.
Yes.
We're talking to Tina Cervasio here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And Tina, you mentioned briefly kind of falling away a little bit as you got to college in terms of your faith. So, and that happens with a lot of us. Sometimes our dreams and our desires sort of get in the way, if you will. And that's not a bad thing. We should have dreams and desires. And sometimes our priorities might get a little out of whack with our faith and our spiritual foundation. What was that like for you going into college? Was your identity completely caught up in just pursuing a job in broadcasting, and that's kind of where the faith fell away?
Yeah, I think so. I was just focused on trying to get comfortable and be happy in school and have friends and do the college thing. And I was the manager of the women's soccer team, which was a great experience because I couldn't play Division I sports, but I found my way in somehow.
Yeah.
So I still had that experience of being like a college athlete, traveling with them, their schedule. I was able to get tutors, hang out with everybody from all my friends from college are pretty much they all played Division I sports, football, field hockey, lacrosse. My best friend in my wedding, soccer, my best 3 friends, we still hang out every year. They were all on the women's soccer team. A lot of it was just, I was busy. I was traveling. So I'm not going to, I don't have time to go to church because we have a game, or I'm in Portland or North Carolina or Tallahassee, Florida on a Sunday. So it didn't become a priority. Now, did I ever lose my faith in God, or, if something had me down or my heart was broken? Of course, I'm praying to the Lord. I always, I was still saved. I still knew that Christ died for my sins.
Right.
I wasn't in church. I wasn't reading the Bible. Then I had a boyfriend, which was kind of great. I mean, we would go to Catholic service every Sunday. So that wasn't a bad thing.
Right.
At least I was back in church, but I wasn't being fed the word. And then when you come out into the real world, and thank God, again, I always look back and I know this, and I know where this comes from. These are my praying parents. I mean, they were at home on their hands and knees praying for me that I would never get caught up into something crazy. Because, I was at all the parties where drugs are being done and et cetera and all this. But thank God, I don't know if it was my faith. I never said, well, I'm not going to do that because I believe in Jesus. I just didn't have a desire or whatever, that God just, he miraculously protected me from certain things. So that's just, so thank God. But as I became an adult, I see now how much I needed the word and being taught and being fed in my life. So, I look back and I see how God protected me. And it's funny, in my church, there's times where our pastor will say, if you have that faith, Jesus knows you're saved and he knows that you believe who he is in your heart, he's going to find you. He's going to get you in the middle of the night. He's going to find ways to bring you back where you're buried in his word so you can then hear from him. And I feel God had done, and he's done it several times. He's had to lead me back to him multiple times with multiple situations.
Absolutely. He does that quite a bit. And we'll talk a little bit more. I know there's a couple moments where that faith was tested for you, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to kind of circle back into the broadcasting industry because I think it's an interesting story. First, I want to know, what was your first professional broadcasting job? That's always a question I like to ask fellow broadcasters.
So I got out of school and I immediately had a job as a sports editor for 4 weekly newspapers. So I was being paid from the day after, 2 weeks after I graduated college, to be a sports journalist. And but I really wanted to get into television. So that was about 5 months. And then I started getting into the production jobs, and I would commute 40 miles out to Long Island. And I don't know if you remember New Sport.
Yeah.
And so it was actually, ESPN had Sports Center, but this was the version when it used to be ESPN News or a Sports Center every half hour. This was that format before that even happened. And eventually that fell apart because then ESPN News was created. But in that job, I really learned how to be a producer, how to find highlights, write leads, tags, write into sound bites. You do that and don't get me wrong, you do that in college and you get your degree. But this was under the pressure of a real show and handing a script to a 20-year broadcast veteran, mostly men. Am I capable of giving them the right information? So that was a wonderful experience. And while I was there, I started doing fake demos, and they would let me go on the set, or I would go out with a reporter and do my fake stand-ups.
Yeah.
And I created this fake resume reel. And about a year after that, and I mean, I lost more jobs than I had probably, because things, whether it was economy or just the ever-changing landscape of sports television, one, network closes and then you get moved to another and that one closes. But I created these fake demos. So my first real on-air job was at Staten Island Cable. And I got that job because I was a runner for Fox Sports, and I would drive as far as DC from New Jersey. I would do NFL games as a runner for $50. It cost me more to drive and pay my gas than I was making. But I would go to games in Philly, in DC, and of course here in New York with the Jets and Giants, Mets, Yankees, all the Fox Sports games, and I'd be a runner. I've driven, and back when Joe Buck was a 27-year-old phenom, I was just a couple of years younger than him, I would pick him up at his nice hotel and drive him to the World Series to get to his game. And I would get coffee for Howie Long. I got all the Long sons that are in the NFL. I used to get them ice cream. So I take pride in their size because I would kind of babysit them a little in the broadcast booth. So, but it was from those jobs that I met these gentlemen where their full-time jobs, they were doing stats or they were spotters for the announcers, and their full-time job was at Staten Island Cable, and they liked me and we got along, and I was New Jersey, but New Jersey and Staten Island and New Yorkers, we all have like an identity crisis where we live. So we all had this kindred spirit, and I went to Staten Island Cable and I did everything there from graphics operator, camera operator, and then I had my first chance as a sideline reporter. I do College of Staten Island games, Wagner men's and women's basketball games. I called play-by-play for girls, PSAL high school championships. So it was, I would lay down cable at a high school football game and then go out and be the sideline reporter and then help them wrap up the cable in our tiny little truck. So that was my first on-air job. And it's amazing, Jason, from those demo reels, I was able to slowly build myself up. I never had to leave the New York area. From there, I went to CN8, which evolved into Comcast, which is now the NBC Universal, they're the NBC Sports Regionals.
Yeah.
So I did sideline reporting for them for arena football. And then during the year, I would it was a ball. I would cover these high school stories. It was called Varsity Sports Zone. And my cohort, we would call each other and make sure we didn't step on each other's toes, was Kevin Burkhardt.
Yeah.
Who is now Mr. Fox Sports, MLB, NFL. And Kevin and I had the two different counties that were right next to each other, Bergen County and Essex County in New Jersey. But sometimes they would bleed into each other. So we would call each other and make sure we weren't doing the same story. So I worked with Kevin on that show. And I just kept hustling, and it's been my story for 20 years.
Well, that's what I tell people. I get so many questions, I'm sure you do too, from young people in college, even high school, about breaking into the business. How do I get to where you're at? How do I get to ESPN? How do I get to be the lead anchor on a Fox 5 New York sports cast? How do I get there? And I tell them, man, you got to cut your teeth in, and you got to grind, and you got to do things that are not glamorous. And yes, you got coffee for Howie Long, but when you look at it, and yes, you're Howie Long, so you're around Howie Long, so that's pretty neat.
Right.
But like, you're getting coffee. But I always tell people, if you're going to get coffee for Howie Long, it better be the best coffee getting person ever if you want to get that chance for the next level. And don't take that lightly. The Bible says, do whatever you're doing as unto the Lord and not to man. Like, you should be excellent at what you're doing, even if you're just getting coffee for someone. And that's not glamorous, but that is how you get your opportunities, by being great at what you're doing at that moment. Talk to those people, talk to those young journalists, Tina, who are trying to cut it. Talk to the young ladies as well, and give them just some advice, some practical tips, the things that you would tell them if you were speaking to a college class or something like that.
And what's interesting is now they might have the opportunity to work in a Beth Moen's broadcast booth, or have a woman calling a game.
That's right.
So that's what's different for them today. But no matter who it was, and looking back then, it never came to my mind that women are a minority in this. I just saw them as broadcasters at the time. And that's why I always say, I hate the label female broadcaster. We're broadcasters, we're sports journalists. Right. So we try to erase that. So my advice would be exactly what you said, Jason. Do it with a smile. Meet as many people as you can. Get the phone numbers, but also observe. And I would observe in the truck how a live sports broadcast was done. And I would see Joe Buck and his bag of information. Like, he really read all that to get ready for this game that could be 2.5 hours depending on the pitcher. And yes, like, that's the kind of preparation. You're not great. Yes, there are natural abilities that you're gifted with. And certain announcers, whether it's their voice, their cadence, the way they could process information. But in the end, you have to prepare in certain ways. And everybody has to prepare harder at different things, so to speak, whether you're an analyst, play-by-play, a reporter. Some people are easier at on-the-fly stuff. I would prepare and go into a game with 20 to 25 prepared sideline reports. And then I would hope that cool stuff would come up during a game, not bad injuries, but, interactions on the sidelines or a record be broken that I could then take emotions and stuff I'm hearing on the sidelines. So I would say, if you're in those coffee situations right now, observe, ask questions. If it's, it's a good question. I met a girl in the street the other day, who had met me at a Knicks game years ago. So now she's graduated from college and she's working a little bit at Columbia, and she's on air, and I'm helping her with her tape. And I just heard of a job that I might help her get, or at least get her up for it to audition for it. And she's about 23 years old. Yeah. And it was because, she wasn't an intern, but she was an aggressive Syracuse student at the time. And she came up to me and asked me questions. And I remembered her, and she tweeted me the picture that we took 7 years ago. And, so do that, make connections. And my example would be, so there's that girl, I'm going to help her get a job right now at 23 years old, anchoring, and it could lead to wonderful things. The BA, Jacob Ullman, who was getting me my little $50 gigs.
I know
he
Jacob.
Hired me.
Yeah, I know Jacob.
You know Jacob well. So he hired me several times for NFL sideline reporting for NFL on Fox when the NBA was in lockout and I was without a job for a couple of months. He got me in there, and now it circles back because I'm going to do a lot of work with, I just did a bunch of work with FS1 for the Big East tournament because the whole Fox family and Fox Sports is doing the World Cup. And now Jacob and I are getting looped back together. And this is a 25-year relationship going back to my first running job. Right out of college for $50. So the relationships last, the people move up in ranks. So you don't realize this gold mine, this opportunity that you're already getting into. And you have to, the hours stink. It's not glamorous, but it's so valuable. It really is.
Yeah. And it's a ruthless business in many ways. And you and I have been in this business for a long time together. We have probably a lot more people that we know in common than we even realize. And shout out to Jacob. It's good to see him at the Super Bowl. But I just wonder, I have to ask the question. You mentioned about the female sports broadcaster, and I don't like that label either. I just think if you're good, and I always have seen it as if you're good at your job, it don't matter who you are. But that's not the case. It's just not how it works for many people. So for you, I'm so impressed with the success that you've had, but how difficult has it been? Or maybe what's the toughest part about being in this business, this sports broadcasting business as a female? Or is there a tough part in your eyes?
Yeah, I've been lucky because I know we have this whole Me Too movement going on. I've never had to go through that situation.
That's good.
Thank God. I was never harassed or anything like that. But I absolutely have sensed just that climate of sexism where she doesn't know as much. Or there might be somebody, a male in the same role as me, and he does this little something extra, almost like an opinionated report or an overall report on a game. And I had requests, hey, why don't I do what so-and-so is doing? No, we're good. Well, why? You don't think I'm capable enough? I mean, I had that job. I was being paid to do that job. Yeah. I just felt a couple of times I wasn't given that opportunity. I had asked to try to do play-by-play once somewhere. And they're like, well, you have no experience. And then they gave it to a male who didn't have experience either. So I was like, well, that's weird. I would have done some demo. I didn't even get to the point where I could do demos, like where you call the fake game off of a video, a recorded game.
Yeah.
So I've seen little moments like that. Here's what I've noticed the most. Well, initially, early on in my career as well, a lot of times say I'd be applying for jobs. And this is before I went to Nesson. My first big break was actually CBS 2 in New York in 2004. But there would be times I was working in radio at the time and still working at Staten Island Cable or CN8 and doing games there. But when I was applying to affiliate jobs across the country or even sports regionals, we already have a woman.
Mm.
So it was like, we have our token woman.
Yeah.
So that was frustrating then, but I couldn't complain about it because, well, good, they have a woman there. I'll keep track of her when she's gone. I'll try to dive into that. So it was kind of like, and it wasn't like I was so offended at the time because that was just the atmosphere of it. Now, here's something, Jason, I'm dealing with, and that's why this Fox 5 job, and we'll get into it, is such a miracle and a blessing. And how could a job be a miracle? And, I've learned so much about my experience the last couple of years, but it is, and I'll explain all of that and how I see God's hands in it in crazy ways. So I want to use it as an advantage to shine my light, and that's why I'm doing this podcast with you, because I've always been a little uncomfortable talking about my faith.
Sure.
But what I've experienced recently, up for a job, I am much more qualified. I'm highly qualified. I mean, Emmy Awards, etc. My experience. I mean, just my demo reel.
Right.
I could do all roles, radio and play-by-play, host, everything. Well, and it comes down to, we're looking for someone younger. And they don't say it to my face, and I don't even know if they've worded it that way to my agent. But my agent's wonderful. My most recent agent and my agent before that, who left the industry. That's why I had partnered with him a couple of years ago. He was pretty honest after he left the industry and said, I struggled with your age, Tina. He goes, and it broke my heart to tell you. But at 40, it was like this big X was put on me. And then people run around and say to me, but look at Andrea Kramer and look at Michelle Tafoya, look at this one and that one and Linda Cohn. But they were already in place and they're so good and it's so subjective. And I still, I'm not as good as them. I still feel that way. Yeah. So I get it. I know you see, but they're in wonderful situations there. But what I was applying for, age was a thing. And how you look. And my current agent even said it a couple times. I said, well, this person got this job. And he's like, she's really attractive. And we just take that with a grain of salt and keep being you and keep plugging because you're knowledgeable and you're comfortable on air, etc. And my mom always says this and it just kind of, I've finally accepted it. God didn't make you that way. So I have another, and I could start dropping names, and I'm trying not to because I have a friend who is so talented in her cunningness and she's smart and she's quick-witted and she's a wordsmith and she is really big right now. But that's her talent. And she says to me all the time, how do you know that? I don't even, she doesn't know certain things in sports. She's like, oh, you know so much more than me. Yeah. And, but everybody's got a different talent. Everybody has a different delivery. My delivery is, and I've been told this, is very Northeast. I speak fast. I use my hands. Sometimes the accent slips in. They can't tell if it's New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Boston. That's where I've worked. So that it's just, and I've spent so much money trying to get rid of my accent or try to talk slower and, practicing and working with coaches. And my mom would always say, God made you a certain way. Show him the glory by being who you are. But Mom, nobody's hiring me. I need a job. We've got to pay the mortgage. I have this car lease that I'm paying. And she would just say, thank God for how he made you because someone will want you for who you are. And that's where I am. I'm in that position right now because I even went to my recent boss and said to him, my news director, I popped in his office like my first week. I said, listen, if you ever want me to change my hair, if you don't like what I'm wearing, I'm looking for critique to help me be better. I want to get better. I'm already learning stuff. My speech, whatever. I said, please, I want good. I've got this job now. I want to be my best I can be for you. Yeah. And he said, wait. And he was waving his hands like, shut up, Tina, stop. He goes, I hired you for you. And I almost fell over.
Yeah.
He said, I hired you for you. And don't worry, if you mess up, we're going to let you know. If you wear something silly, we're going to let you know. And don't dye your hair pink. He said, but he says, I hired you for you. So please go be you and get out of my office. And that was God. Like, I could just almost feel the hand of God saying, see how I made you. And this is who they hired.
That's so good. It's almost like your mom was speaking through your boss and saying,
Yeah.
just be you, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We're talking to Tina Cervasio here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And Tina, in 2008, you start your job with the New York Knicks as a reporter with MSG on their telecasts. And you worked there for many years, but then you were telling me off there, something happened powerfully in 2010 that made you do some soul searching. And it didn't happen with that job specifically, but it happened while you were in that job in 2010 that made you do some soul searching and sent you back to God's word a little bit. Can we talk about that? Can you share a little bit about what happened there?
Yes. And I was having just like a wonderful year in 2010. My husband and I went on vacation. We went to Italy for 3 weeks and just spent like at the beginning of the summer. And we just spent the rest of that summer kind of reflecting on that. It was a fun summer because that was NBA free agency when LeBron first became available. So
I'll never forget it.
yes, so, I was at there. I'll never forget the pain when he said he was taking his talent to South Beach. I was outside that Greenwich, Connecticut Boys and Girls Club, going live, and so it was really a great experience in my career at the time. Amari Stoudemire was one of the players who said yes, and he was just a big, grand personality, and got to go to Europe with the Knicks that fall. We went to Milan with Danilo Gallinari was like our headliner there. And then we went to Paris, France for games. And Rony Turioff was our headline player there. And then you had Amari with all of it. Mm-hmm. So I was really happy and doing some great fun things. And my husband wasn't feeling good. And I'll never forget, my friend had a baby and we went to visit her and his wedding ring fell off in her when we went to visit her. And I'm like, we're searching for it under her bed. And she just had a baby. And she said, oh, Kevin, you've gotten so skinny. And when you're with your spouse, you see them every day. And my husband is not one to go work out. He plays golf. He's athletic in that aspect, but he's not one to say no to bread or work out. But I was like, oh, gosh, he did get skinny. What are you doing, Kev? He's like, I'm just not hungry. So I had attributed it to we were walking more as a couple at night. But then he started complaining about pain. And started going to doctors, long story short. And this was still during the preseason. I had a day off and we arranged it on my day off because I had to drive him and, all his doctor's appointments, he had to go for a colonoscopy. He was not in his colonoscopy for more than 5 minutes. And the doctor came running into me in the waiting room. We have found a massive tumor the size of probably like what was it? A grapefruit or, a small ball at the time. And he says, we're going to have to immediately admit him into the hospital and see what this is. I've taken a biopsy. So it's amazing how in 5 minutes, everything can be sent to a tailspin. Yeah. The next day I was supposed to leave with the Knicks for Toronto for opening night in Toronto. So my husband eventually gets operated on. So it's basically emergency surgery. And he comes out and the doctor couldn't even remove the tumor because he had so much infection. It was so big that it perforated his colon and he did have colon cancer. And so our journey began, and he had to go through weeks and weeks of antibiotics. So the tumor's still in him, and he's got tubes coming out of him. And he had to go through weeks and weeks of antibiotic before they could start administering chemotherapy because they had to get rid of that first. He could have died of sepsis. It wasn't even the cancer that was killing him at the time. Yeah. It was the infection. So I'll never forget. So we had his diagnosis was October 23rd. He had his operation the 25th. I made it to Toronto and did my game the 26th, but it was so dark. It was just the darkest time. And, so then of course, you go running back to church. So my parents very involved in their church and and a lot of their friends from our original Full Gospel Church, they had branched off as elders and they had all their own churches now. So we had pastors from several different churches, just praying with us, visiting our house. My husband, and I don't want to throw him under the bus. He knows the Bible better than I do. He's tried church born again, saved, Full Gospel Church a few times. He doesn't go, but he lets me. And I remember the visions, the memories I have from him being sick and shriveling away and going through the chemo. And when I would sit with him before going to Knicks games, I would sit with him at Sloan Kettering, going through his chemo, just reading him the Bible, just reading him verses. Friends of ours, pastors, sent us a new Bible that had like little, great annotations and studying, so you didn't have to go elsewhere and study, and different versions and translations. And I would just read him verses. And sometimes I didn't know what verse. I'm like, let's read Psalms today. Let's read Jeremiah. Right. And he would just sit there and let me read, and we would pray. But it was dark. It was a dark time. I never doubted God. I just kept praying for God, Kevin's healing. My husband's name is Kevin. Kevin's healing is a couple years older than me. And then slowly but surely, and it was hectic with work, but they were supportive. And I started finding a lot of Christians that I didn't know were Christians. So, for example, Roger Hines, the Knicks, longtime head trainer, he would take me aside and pray with me. And many shoot-arounds, I'd be in tears because I'd be getting these phone calls. I'd be in Boston on the road. Alan Houston is a Christian and very strong with his faith. Oh, yes. He would pray for me. He would text me. He was the first person. It was like 5:30 in one morning in June when my husband finally was better from his chemo. They shrunk the tumor and they were ready to operate. First person that texted me was Alan Houston and prayed with me. Landry Field's mother had seen me tweeting about it and, asking for, prayers up for my husband. People knew he was suffering. And she was like a prayer warrior for me. Wow. And it was all through my experience in sports. And thank God, my husband was healed and he's become, it's difficult. And this is a whole nother topic too, being a woman and being in sports. It's difficult when you're married and traveling. I mean, I traveled. The really difficult time was when I was living in Boston. I had a little studio in Boston and my husband was still in our townhouse here in New Jersey, and I was doing the Red Sox, and that baseball schedule is brutal. So, we had, not brutal struggles through our marriage, but there's sacrifices, and it just wasn't fun. Like it's not easy on a marriage. There's nothing good about that. Right. And then cause you're just apart and you don't know who each other is as you grow. And then thank God I got the job at MSG, and it initially was an anchoring job, and then the economy crashed. And that's when they put me on Knicks because of my Red Sox experience. So I was back on the road again. But so it was, we never initially planned on having children. We don't have children, but it was just all this pressure on a young couple. And so it was just hard, but and I think Christians can understand this. So I watch who I say it to, but that cancer experience, and he is 6 years out now, and he had successful surgery, and we had prayer warriors. And like I said, he heard that word. I would just read, and he listened to the Bible. Like he's a hero now. He's like that real knight in shining armor because he survived for me. I did not want to lose him. Yeah. And we are best friends. We're like, we could call us everything. We're partners in crime. We're partners in supporting each other. My crazy hours, he gets up he would not go to sleep. If I had to wake up 1:30 a.m. for a 3 a.m. call, he would not go to sleep. He would make sure that I was up. I had some issues with Uber drivers over the years. So he drives me to airports at 4 a.m. sometimes. So he is, and that's because of his healing. And he really fought. He even had a relapse during the NBA lockout. So here's how God works. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling.
No, please.
So he has his surgery in June 1st of 2011. And they were able to not just, and successfully remove that tumor, and they checked, nothing spread because they were pumping. He's 6'4", and I guess it was like about 260 when he started with the cancer, and he whittled all the way down. But he was strong, and that's why they pumped him up with this crazy chemo. He was able to withstand it, and so they whittled down that tumor, and he did have a colostomy bag. And he said to me, "I don't even care about, I'll go for chemo, I'll go for radiation again. I just want this bag gone." Like he just, for his masculinity and his manhood, that bothered him. Yeah. He's like, "I'll do chemo the rest of my life. I just don't want this bag." And so that was part of my prayers. I'm like, Lord, if this is a full healing, you got to get the cancer out of his body, and we need to just close him up. We just need to close him up from this bag. And thank God when that doctor called me in after praying with Alan Houston and Landry Field's mom, because he was playing with the Knicks at the time, Landry, he said, "Yep, we closed him up. There's no bag." And he had some complications a few months later. It was September. Again, there was pain. And Jason, I was going to speak at the American Cancer Association dinner with Kevin And it was put together by Coaches versus Cancer. So there's always a sports tie-in. And in my dress, we were all dressed up. I had to rush into the emergency room. And he ended up in the hospital for another month because they had to reoperate. His colon collapsed. Thank God it wasn't cancer, but this is just things that happen after cancer, complications. And here's the Lord's hand in everything. The NBA was locked out. So while I was upset that because I was on a freeze, so I wasn't making money at the time. I was doing, thank God, a little NFL, a little college football for CBS.com. God provides in these little ways. But I had the free time because I would have reported to preseason training camp the next morning of the night that I had rushed my husband into the emergency room on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So that next month I was able to just be with him and nurse him. And, if I had to go somewhere for two days, he was okay. Or his parents, thank God, would take over, or my parents would help out. And so God, he gets you through it. And that really got me my face back in the Bible, just reading it. Now, I didn't find a church at the time that I really loved. I still felt, and I was working a lot of Sundays, let's be honest. I was traveling a lot, but it got me back in the Word and on the phone with Christians and different leaders from churches, like in other areas where it'd just be part of commute. But it just showed me he's such a powerful God. And even when you slip away, and it wasn't like we were doing anything evil but he will draw you back to the Christian that he wants you to be, the believer, someone that really stands for the relationship of Jesus. And that was a really super strong point in our life. So I thank God for healing my husband and just making our marriage it kind of built on his healing. And that's why I appreciate it every day.
Well, trials are tough, period, just as humans. And then when you have a faith, I think, it doesn't make them easier, but it makes them sustainable, I guess, because of who God is. But then you were telling me in 2015, your faith's kind of growing even more and it's becoming a vital part of your life. And then the contract with the Knicks is not renewed and something happens there. Can you kind of take us through the dream job aspect and kind of losing your dream job and where the Lord was with you during that time?
Yeah. And now today, Jason, I could look back and say, well, wait, this was God's plan. And that's what makes me so comfortable and at peace and free today that I talk to you. In 2013, and again, like you're just, and at the time, and this is where I learned today too, and where I've changed as a professional, as a broadcaster. So my husband's healed and, we're doing great. And the Knicks, 12-13, they have a great season, 54 wins. They're going into the second round of the playoffs. But in my career life, I had always wanted more. So I was always asking for more. Well, I want to do more features. I could do this story. I want to do this aspect. Or I would go out and do extra work, and they didn't like the angle, and the feature would get changed. So I was always even I had a job and I was in a stable job with a contract. I always felt like I was being rejected. I always felt like I was being let down. I always felt like I could do more. And at the time I would be applying to, let's be honest, ESPN and TNT and CBS, trying to get that big job because I only had one more level to go. I'm in the largest market. I'm covering an NBA team every day. I'm on television hours and hours a year. But I just wanted to get to that next level where I would have a solid national job. And I was doing some sideline reporting for the Big Ten network, but it was freelance. So it wasn't a 13-game package, obviously, because I had a full-time job where I did 82 games. Yeah. And so now looking back, that was probably wrong of me because I was looking way too far ahead. I wasn't focusing and living in my moment. I wasn't focusing at my job at hand. I was worried about, I want to get to ESPN or this or that. And I wasn't appreciating or being happy or being content. And so I was always searching, and I was never satisfied. But in 2013, there was like this new guy hanging around the Knicks, in NBA. People there's guys. Everybody's got their guys. Some guys have 10 guys. Some NBA players have one guy. And this was Tyson Chandler's guy. And he was super nice. And I thought he was his stylist because he had really cool clothes and, the leather and the cool boots and he had great hair. So I had asked after a few weeks, he was so nice. Carl. I said, well, who is Carl? What does he do? He's on the bus. Right? Yes. And it ended up being Carl Lentz. And the person I asked said, well, he's Tyson Chandler's spiritual counselor. I'm like, spiritual counselor? And then I knew right away. I was like, Tyson's a Christian.
Right.
This guy's he's a pastor or something. And then you start putting two and two together. And Landry Fields and it was back to Landry. God bless him. I've talked to him. I got to reach out to him. He had tweeted a few times about him and his wife going to Hillsong Church. There's this new church in New York, Hillsong NYC. Oh my, we're blessed by the music. And you would see these pictures and it looked like a Broadway play.
Yeah.
And Landry was tweeting a lot about it. And he was speaking more about his relationship with Christ in post-game interviews. And he was saying the name of Jesus and giving the glory to God a lot more. So I was like, kind of, oh, wait a minute, Landry's growing. This is interesting. And then he had left the Knicks, and I had seen it even more when he was in Toronto and how he talked about God's plan, even though he was upset. So, you're learning from these guys putting himself out there, how they handle things. And, long story short, started talking to Carl. I'm like, hey, Carl, I'm a Christian. You're a pastor, right? And this and that. And then before you know it, I'm going to Hillsong Church. Wow. And I thank God, planted Carl for whatever reasons at that time, because eventually Tyson was traded. So we lost Carl in the mix, but right. he was still there, but he was not as prominent. He was still Knicks games and Nets games. But I was going to the church, and now I have connected with this message and how they treat, and it was a youthful church, and the songs and come as you are, and we're not going to turn anybody away. And it really spoke to me, and the preachers, and I would go to extremes to make sure I got to a service. And that I was in the Word, and that prepared me for the day I really did not see coming, and I blame myself for this. I get a phone call. I was just at the NBA draft the night before. Kristaps Porzingis is drafted. It's a fun night. I'm interviewing him. I hear about this trade for Jaren Grant, and then I'm interviewing Victor Oladipo because they're best friends. It's just like this fun, crazy night, and I'm introduced to Porzingis' parents, and I'm learning Latvian words. And not even 12 hours later, because I got home at 2 a.m. and because it's a long night, and Brooklyn's so far from New Jersey. 10 a.m. the next morning, I'm out of a job. Oh, we're not renewing your contract. Wait, what? It was just completely out of left field. And I don't know, were there signs? Maybe, as I look back. And everybody would always say to me, what's the because then I started interviewing for jobs right away, and Jason, I couldn't get a job to save my life. Now I was freelancing, so what had happened was, so my contract was up in 2 days. That was called on a Friday. My contract was up Monday. However, again, God's hands in everything. He will never let you down. He's going to always provide for your needs, not what you want necessarily. Like I wanted, ESPN and TNT and a national job, and wanted to keep that next job. Well, but God provided what I needed. And I still somehow, the Red Bulls were not happy with that decision, because the Red Bulls are clients. The Knicks are owned, they're under the same umbrella of MSG Network. They're owned by Jim Dolan, etc. Now the Red Bulls are a client, so they have a deal with MSG. But as clients, they said, no, we want Tina on this broadcast when we have a game Wednesday. We are, as the owners, well, it was the front office. They wanted me to stay on, and they were able to convince MSG for me to continue with the Red Bulls. And that was God's hand, because I still had a job. I was still on television. I got great advice from a producer, because I was freelancing at Fox 5. He said, you take that job, you take that check, you go on air with a smile. Don't just be who you are, be a great broadcaster. Don't think of your situation with MSG. You go do every Red Bulls game like it's the Super Bowl, and you just keep moving on. It was great advice. He's my producer today on Fox 5, Lou Albanese. But I was able to continue with the Red Bulls for another 2.5 years. So it was the rest of that year and another 2 years. And at the time, I was just so devastated and shocked, and I was so sad. And I look back, and I'm like, why? Now I look back. Why was I so sad? Well, I was sad because I had identified with my job. Yep. I was Tina, Knicks reporter. And that's how they labeled you on Page 6 or in the Daily News when they write an article. Knicks reporter Tina Cervasio got this quote from Carmelo Anthony, and this, everything was based on the Knicks in my life, and I had just identified with that instead of me as a person, as a child of God. That's who I was. And that's who I know I am today.
Yeah.
I'm not Tina, the sportscaster. I'm just Tina, child of God. I'm trying to be the best wife, aunt, as an influence on my nieces and nephews, trying to be a good daughter as my parents begin aging. That's what I take pride in and focus in now. And yes, in my job, I want to do it unto God now. I want to do it so people can see the light and that I'm, have a relationship with Christ. But I wasn't doing that then. And I was putting all my faith in like this label. And people would ask me on these job interviews, well, what did you learn from losing that job? And I didn't even know why I was let go. I just kept hearing, time to make a change, time to make a change. And that upset me because I wanted to learn what was it? Why, how the heck did I lose this job that I was in for 8 years, and won Emmys, and people seemed to like me.
Right.
And then when the reaction was, and then it got confusing. I would get phone calls from coaches around the NBA as they started trickling in. Players would reach out to me, and big time broadcasters. Keep your head up. We think you're great. Don't worry about this happens. It's subjective. Stuff like this happens. Yeah. But it was again, that word dark. Here, my husband, we thought he was dying. So this was why I look back and I almost feel like ashamed that I ever felt this way about a silly job. But you do lose, your income. And I lost my identity at the time. But now from that whole experience, Jason, and it took about 2.5, and it took a while.
Yeah.
I had a bad year, even though I was working. But each day, God provided a little freelance job that helped me pay this bill and that bill. And I would go to work with a smile, whether I was freelancing and filling in at Fox 5. I was doing I went from the Knicks and people could say and there were some hurtful comments because I was doing the NASL, which now is not even in existence this year. It's in a hiatus, but I was covering the Cosmos. Yeah. But I didn't care because somebody was paying me to cover sports. And that's where I started to evolve. And going back to church and meeting Carl Lentz and going to Hillsong, God put me in that place so I was able to run to my Christian friends and go to church every Sunday and be fed and hear stories from the Bible and just read different Christian books. Like, it was funny. I bought a book. I was fired, and it's the best thing that ever happened to me. I still haven't read it because then I was reading the Bible. I read books like The Comeback by Louis, is it Giglio or
Louis Giglio? Yeah,
Louis Giglio. I read that book twice. I read Jesus Take the Wheel with Stuart Migden, yep. Right? So I started reading faith-based Christian books over the course of the next couple years. Just learning. God does certain things, and I truly believe. And I did not know this at the time. I did not know this a year later. But God, when I think there's a quote, and it's and I have Bible verses I'll share too that I've kind of lived on. But there's a quote along the way, and I'm kind of looking it up right now on my phone. I just found it. To anyone that God intends to promote and make great, he assigns, and I wrote her because of course it had him. Yeah. He assigns her a waiting season. He elevates you. He strengthens you. He molds you. Be patient and humble and obedient. Prepare for what you expect. God had to put me in this waiting season because I needed that as a Christian. Mm. And it was like, I'm so grateful for it. Like, of course, I loved that job, but I still was working with the Red Bulls, and I became a better pregame host and halftime host with the CBS Sports Network job that I got. They used to say to me, they were so wonderful, get in those huddles, get in there. We want to hear what that coach says. Edit out the profanity, but we need to know because I couldn't do that in my previous job with the Knicks. It was just you're hired by you're a team reporter. It was just different, but I was forced to be a reporter and not have to worry about pleasing people. That I had to please the audience and my bosses who were new. So it didn't matter what team. So I was able to evolve so much as a journalist and a broadcaster over those 2 years, but also as a Christian. And there was the one verse that I've just totally prayed on and meditated on and believed that God led me to right out of the gate. And I put it on my Twitter bio early in this whole journey. Jeremiah 29 and 11 through 14, all 4 verses. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. So I was like, you know what? This is God's plan. But at the time, I didn't know that. And here's the other thing I learned. After the whole identity thing, I have to identify I'm a child of God. I'm his daughter. But I also had to surrender. And I was looking in the past too much. So I just really had to hand over all of my just insecurities and feelings of rejection. Oh, I'm getting emotional.
Okay.
And it's so stupid to me because, again, it's a job, and I'll never get upset about a job again like this. But it was whatever those emotions were, God stirred those up in me, and I thank God because I am who I am today because of that. It's so silly.
No, it makes complete sense, and I know a lot of people who've shared the same similarity. Honestly, I've had that issue too. Your job becomes so consumed with who you are. Still to this day, I'm the
Right.
ESPN guy at my church, and it's like I haven't worked there in over a year. And
Yes.
you'll always be identified with that sort of public thing, and yet when you're really stripped down to the core of who you are, we're all just people who are in need of a savior. And that's what it is. And that's why you so eloquently said that we're just children of God who need him. And so I understand completely.
Yes.
But I want to ask you, I asked this question actually to Pat Williams recently on the podcast, the great longtime general manager in the NBA and now the senior VP with the Orlando Magic. And he said that John Wooden was asked this question, and I'm basically stealing it from him. But I think it's just a great question to ask people going forward. So I haven't asked this question as much on the podcast. I usually ask, what is the Lord teaching you right now? Which is sort of that final question I ask on the podcast. But I'll ask this one as the final one for you, Tina. When it's all said and done, and I think I know what your answer might be now based on what you just told me, but I'm going to ask it. When it's all said and done and you reach the end of your life, how do you want to be remembered?
I want to be, and that's what I'm trying to do right now. So
Yeah,
the Lord is teaching me to do that right now, my job. Someone where, people can say, well, there's something about her. Oh, it's got to be God within her. And that's why I'm, getting to the, point where I want to share that I have a relationship with Christ. I have a relationship with Jesus.
Right.
And I've learned about that as a little girl at 10 years old, admit to that you believe that Christ died for our sins, but it's the relationships that's so important. And I saw the miracles of God in my husband's life and his battle of cancer and the way he recovered. I see the miracle of God in the way he provides when you have faith. And even when I didn't surrender, he still provided all of my needs. Every bill got paid. I was still on television. And, but I want people to see, like, it seems corny, but the light. I want, when I do a sport, so when I do a story, now I wanted to see it. Well, oh, I never saw that angle before, or I never thought of it that way. And, there's a lot of, I call them the negative newsies, because I am in a news atmosphere right now. They want the nasty story and break that story, but I want to break something wonderful and bring the positive news, because I read the good news every day in the Bible. Right. So how can I look for that in sports and try to find those great stories of overcoming? So, I do want people to say, wow, she really brought good stories, and we learned things about a game or a player or a situation that we didn't know before because of her positive look. So you hear so many of these motivational speakers, and they're great. But I want them to know that positivity and trying to be good and be right every day comes from my relationship with Christ.
She is Tina Cervasio, and it has been a pleasure, Tina. She's currently the Fox 5 New York's lead sports anchor reporter. She's also the host of the Sunday night sports show in New York, Sports Extra, the first woman to serve as the permanent host of Sports Extra. It's been on the air for nearly a half century, and it's been wonderful hearing your story, hearing your journey, Tina. Thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. Appreciate you.
Oh, Jason, thank you so much for having me on. I've learned so much from the stories you've told through your guests on your podcast.
And we do thank Tina Cervasio for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. I really enjoyed getting to hear Tina's story, and I love that she got emotional at the end. I know we talked off the air and she kind of apologized for that, but I like it when people get emotional because it means they care. It means that, something as serious as her faith and kind of all that she's been able to overcome, that hits home. And I think we all have those moments where we tear up or get emotional. And I'm so glad that Tina did that. I'm so glad that she came on the podcast. and shared her story. Lots to learn there, I think, from Tina, especially if you're an aspiring broadcaster or podcaster. Just hearing Tina's journey about how she got into the business, take some notes there, because it is not an easy business to get into, and Tina really explained kind of the grind that exists when you're trying to get into the broadcasting business. And I also loved her heart for the Lord and coming back to God, and kind of finding and realizing that her identity is not in what she does, but in what Jesus did for us. And that, my friends, is the most important thing that any of us could ever discover, is who our identity is truly in. So thank you to Tina for joining us here on the podcast, and thank you to you for listening to this podcast. As always, you can reach us on Twitter at sports_spectrum. We're on Facebook and Instagram as well. Just look up Sports Spectrum there. Love to hear from you. Love to hear what you think. You can send us an email. You can email me directly, jason@sportspectrum.com. And you can also leave a review. That would be great. On iTunes, go to iTunes and leave a 5-star review. If you love the podcast, let us know what you think of our interview with Tina. And really the best way to get this podcast seen and heard by many people is by you using your social media platform, or you using the power of the spoken word and telling others about this podcast, letting them know that we're telling stories on the intersection of sports and faith, and telling people about Tina Cervasio, and definitely giving her a follow on Twitter as well, and letting her know that you heard the Sports Spectrum podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum.